Hi, welcome to the Learning Loop podcast. My name is Chris Ridding. I'm a postdoc in computer science at University of Washington, and on this show I talk about Learning Loop. I defined Learning Loop as a framework and a philosophy very clearly in episode 1 of this podcast, which you can find on the channel. And basically, it tries to solve many problems in our lives through the lens of helping us to remember more and forget less, or remember the right things and forget not the right things. Not forget the right things. So there are 3 steps of Learning Loop. The first step is to write down the things that matter most in your life. Epiphanies, things that stick out, connections that are especially salient. The second thing is to make those notes accessible to a future you that needs them to solve a problem or to answer a question. And then the third thing is to actually use those notes to solve your problems and answer a question. So in the show, I spend every episode going over a different aspect of Learning Loop. Today, I'm going to advocate for a thing called meaningful grounding to solve a class of problems that I call meaning problems. So we'll be using Learning Loop to write a general recipe for solving the problem of meaninglessness in life by iteratively making the important parts of our lives mean what we want them to mean. So what am I talking about with all this? What am I getting at? Well, let me tell you a story having to do with meaning and meaninglessness. I got a PhD about a year ago, and that was a 5-year journey. And at first, it was really exciting because I had gone through a couple of different career iterations, and I'd found this one career iteration that meant a lot. It meant that I could scale up the things that I was building to serve a lot of people in the world. And it meant that I could pursue understanding the way that the world is through science. And it meant that I could be around people that were really interesting to me. So the word PhD stood for all of these things. At first, it felt exciting. It meant all these things in my mind. And then, eventually, it came to mean less and less those things and more a different thing. I basically, going into work every day, would feel anxious that I was going to be in a meeting where somebody else was performing better than I was. Or I got nervous about being confused about what to do of all of my many projects and all of my many tasks that I had to do. So the word PhD came to mean something else. It came to feel meaningless, but viscerally it felt anxious and it felt uncomfortable. So this is a vignette that represents a broader problem. And I think that this problem is a class of problems that I would call meaning problems. Basically, we let our jobs or our relationships or our goals lose their original or intended meaning. And I think that this happens in 2 main ways. I call them meaning drain and meaning drift. In the first, meaning drain, we let the symbols, like in this case, the PhD, the word PhD, a symbol is a word, basically, or a phrase that stands for something much richer and deeper, a concept. So we let the symbol, like the word PhD, that meaning just kind of deteriorates or dissolves. It loses the meaning that it once had. So this also might be like when a goal loses its punch and it stops motivating us in the way that it once did, and we give up on it. And presumably, we'd rather not give up on it. We'd like the goal, the symbol of the goal, to keep meaning what it originally meant and keep filling us with this energy and with this conviction and with this motivation. In the second problem that I call meaning drift, we let the symbol's meaning not disappear entirely, but get supplanted by a different kind of meaning. So the symbol of PhD here comes to mean not the original slate of exciting things that I gestured at in my original conception of the PhD, scaling up, solving problems, etc., but it comes to mean something else. It comes to mean the wrong thing to us. And so in this case, the thing that it meant to me was anxiety, and it meant inferiority, and it meant confusion and overwhelm. Presumably, that is an unpleasant thing for you. Maybe you like that feeling, but I didn't like that feeling. And it reminded me of other situations where I have meaning drifts, like when a relationship becomes onerous or burdensome, as another example. But we'd also presumably rather not have that happen, and instead we'd like the relationship to give joy and to keep meaning what it originally meant, the reason that we entered into the relationship in the first place. So, with meaning drain and meaning drift being two examples of this cluster of problem that I call meaning problems, I will argue that the solution is meaningful grounding, that phrase that I introduced, with Learning Loop, where you establish the meaning of high level, potentially abstract symbols, like the word PhD, or like your marriage. The word marriage stands for this much more deep, rich, intricate concept of your relationship, your full relationship with another person. So I want to just return to the definition of some of these words. So one of the words that I've been using is symbol. I keep saying the symbol of PhD or the symbol of marriage. By a symbol, I just mean a word. So like in math, you use X to refer to something, or you use Y to refer to something in general. And so the symbol X is attached to the concept that it represents. So these might be words, they might be phrases, they might be numbers, and these stand for something else besides the word or the phrase or the number. They might refer to a person, or they might refer to a chapter in your life, or a subject of study. The things that a symbol, like PhD or like marriage, refers to, that is a concept. They're the rich, full representation of the things that the symbol points to. And so when I ask you about your marriage and this flood of emotions and this flood of representations and connections and thoughts and feelings comes to your mind, that's the concept that you're thinking of. And so in general, you have like these mappings from these symbols to these concepts. And what's true about these symbol concept associations is that they're not super neat. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not collectively exhaustive. It's not the case that one symbol always maps to the same thing. Instead, you have what in mathematics we would call many-to-many mapping. You have many things mapping to many other things, whereas if there was one symbol for every concept, you'd have a one-to-one mapping. So the many-to-many mapping means that when I say marriage, many things are pointed to by the symbol of marriage, including maybe some anxiety, including maybe a lot of joy, including maybe devotion. These are the concepts that are pointed to by marriage, and devotion might also be pointed to by other symbols like friendship or like discipleship or other things. And so there's this web of, symbols and concepts that point to each other. And meaning is the significance or the purpose or the underlying truth of all of these associations. And so I would say the concepts are these nodes over here, and the symbols are these nodes over here, and the meaning is kind of like the strength of the relationships between the symbols and the concepts. So the reason that a symbol is rich in its associations is because you've had a lot of experience with it. So when I say the word mother, it's likely that you've had a complicated relationship with your mother and that you associate both hard times and good times and complications and simplicity with your mother. Or maybe instead of the word God or belief or victory, you think of and maybe instead of the word mother, the word is God, or it's belief, or it's victory. But in all of these cases, the word carries with it lots of meaning because of the great variety and robustness of experience that goes along with that word, that symbol. This is the reason why Pavlov's dog started salivating at the sound of the bell, because the bell is a symbol that represents the concept of all those meals. And the meaning of the bell for those dogs was that food is coming down the pipe after the bell rings. And so how each meal tasted on each day that those dogs were in a certain level of hungry or in a certain mood, that is the entirety of the meaning of the symbol for the dog. So as a rule, the concept should always be richer than the symbol. The symbol is actually like a shortcut to the concept, and it's a way to quickly tap into the fullness of the concept without having to relive every memory or recount every experience or repeat every word that was ever said in relation to the symbol. And human learning is actually, like I would argue, the entirety of our associating these symbols and these concepts with our lived experience. So that's a lot about symbols and concepts and meaning. Some of those associations, I would argue, are good, and some of those associations are bad. Some of them are healthy, some of them are unhealthy, some are accurate, and some are inaccurate. So, like, examples of what could be good in some cases are true knowledge, true understanding of relationships, of physical laws, moral views of the world and each other. These can be good things, healthy things, accurate associations. And then there are these other class of things that can be bad, like addictions or irrational human biases or misconceptions. These can be bad, unhealthy, or inaccurate associations. And the question is, why have some of our associations become poor? Why have some of them become impoverished? Why is it hard to motivate ourselves to remember why we married this person, or to remember why we're friends with that person, or to remember why we're pursuing this goal, or why we've chosen this career? I think that it's because this meaning drain and drift. So in terms of symbols and concepts, we can revisit these definitions, and we can say that meaning drain is where the symbol becomes detached somehow from the concept that it represents. The symbol becomes meaningless. So my PhD stopped meaning all those exciting things that it initially meant for me, and it's become something devoid of meaning. So a marriage might become devoid of the concepts of devotion and of relationship, or a career might be devoid of what you're accomplishing. There's another case, meaning drift, where the symbol not only detaches from its own real concepts, but it becomes attached to other pathological concepts. So a marriage doesn't just get detached from the concept of devotion, but it gets attached with unsatisfaction or dissatisfaction, or it becomes attached to the feeling of anxiety, the concept of anxiety. Or a career might become attached with the concept of confusion or burnout or exhaustion. And again, this is only so bad as it upsets you. Like if you are in a situation where you feel like all of your associations between the important symbols in your life, be that marriage or career or goals or PhD, if all those things are associated with the right things in your mind, and you've never struggled with meaning drift or meaning drain or meaning problems, and you never will struggle with meaning drift or meaning drain or meaning problems, then it's likely that meaningful grounding is not for you, and maybe learning loop broadly is not for you. But now that we have lost the people that don't have problems to solve with meaningful grounding, everybody else, presumably who's still listening, thinks that losing and degrading meaning is bad. So for all of you, the bad news is that this is nature, and it will inevitably happen. Human learning, conceptual drift, these things will happen to you. But the good news on the flip is that it can be counteracted with deliberate action. So the goal, I would say, is to associate the symbols we want with the concepts we want. And you might ask, how am I going to do that? That's a good question. I think that the way to do this is through the practice of meaningful grounding. So this has a lot to do with episode 3, which is hard versus soft thought flows, where I argue that soft thought flows are kind of like the mushy mess of human learning that kind of automatically happens, and then hard thought flows are basically programmed thought flows where you go from one concept to another because you've written it down somewhere and it can't change without you deliberately changing it. Whereas in your brain, things are changing all the time without you necessarily trying to change them. So meaningful grounding is the act of deliberately attaching a symbol to a concept because of the fact that a symbol can take on many concepts. So tools for this in the concept of learning loop, since we preoccupy ourselves with the taking of notes and the organizing of notes so that they're accessible in the future, and the leveraging of notes to achieve specific aims, whether that be solving a problem or answering a question. There are several tools that you can use in the domain of notes to accomplish this purpose. And so some of the tools that I would suggest are like definition sections in your notes, where you define a concept to be one thing instead of another set of things. And so if you define your marriage as, I've decided to enter in, basically if you like copy and paste your vows into the definition section of your marriage, then every time you kind of come to think, this marriage isn't that exciting, it's not that fulfilling for me, maybe if you revisit that definition section, then it can serve as a resource to you to meaningfully ground the symbol which has been detached from the original conception, presuming that what your marriage originally meant was the vows that you made on your wedding day, and you kept for 2 years before you kind of lost track of them and you started living by some other rules. A definition section can ground you in meaning that way. Another set of tools is like how-to sections in your notes. So, for example, if, reading as an activity is a symbol for the concept of what you do when you're reading, you're going to learn how to read by doing all of your reading and by thinking the things that you think while you're reading and by having the goals that you have while you're reading. And the whole point of this is that that's a really messy process. And so if you program in basically how you read and how-to section on your reading page, and then you consult that before you do 1 hour or 2 hour blocks of reading in the future, then you can ground what the symbol of reading means in these codified principles. Like, so for me, one of the important things to remember while I'm reading that I have written down in my notes, in my how-to section of my notes, is to move quickly, getting a sense of the forest from the trees. And that's been helpful to me as a resource of what reading is supposed to mean and what I'm supposed to do while I'm reading, because what I do while I'm reading is kind of what reading means to me. Another tool that I'd advocate is the purpose section of a page. So if you have the purpose of your career, for example, being, I don't know, maybe you want to, a mission statement that I've been kind of toying around with as a grand goal. Like, I bet that OpenAI has in their purpose section of their manifesto, of their internal documentation, develop AGI. Like every company has a mission statement like this. And you can have a mission statement for yourself where you decide what various of your missions mean. You have various different roles. And so like you can decide what you mean as a mother, or what you mean as a father, or what your goal in your career is, what the purpose of the career is. And so if you have a purpose in your section, like I've been toying around with the idea of my purpose in my career being to automate 90% of unpleasant labor. And that is different than the goal of artificial general intelligence, which is what OpenAI has their mission. And it means more to me to automate 90% of unpleasant labor than it does to create artificial general intelligence. And so that is a resource for me that resonates with me, that I wrote down because I want to be reminded of my career meaning that, instead of my career meaning nothing, or instead of my career, the symbol, meaning something that I just accidentally come to believe, like making money or winning power or influence, or other competing things that can creep in over time. So I'm meaningfully grounded there. I want to show you a couple of concrete examples from my notes so that you get a sense of how some of this stuff looks. So here we are in my daily notes page, and from my daily notes page, I can navigate to a page that I have called Career. And this is an example of where I have decided that my career is not something, and instead that it is something else. And so here I entertained the idea of being a musician at some point. And eventually I wrote the argument, I'm not going to be a musician, it's too late, and I've demonstrated enough of a lack of talent to distinguish myself in that field. So these are reasons that I shouldn't be a musician, and this informs the meaning of what my career is. It is something that is not musician, this section says. I also entertained the idea of becoming a journalist at some point, and the reasons against this are that it doesn't scale and I want to do something that scales. I mentioned that earlier in this podcast when I justified doing a PhD. So that's another thing. I'm not a musician and I'm not a journalist. These are things that my career does not mean. Because sometimes I still have the inclination, oh, it'd be really fun to be a musician, or oh, it'd be really fun to be a journalist. But these are things that I have basically written down as resources to remind myself what my career is and what my career is not. So lastly, we have researcher, and it's this much bigger section where I have reasons for. I talk about it on my research page, so I can go there for a reference. Thinking of things at the conceptual level is really fun, and getting them to work is pretty rewarding. I mentioned earlier the idea of scale, and so, my career, I have done a little bit of meaningful grounding for my career in this page of my notes that I can refer to at any time. Another place where I've done some meaningful grounding is in my research page. So here I have this mission statement that I was talking about in the abstract earlier. And I have as a couple of tenets of my mission statement, I want all the thinking that has been done to be accessible. And then I go on about what that means and why it's useful and yada, yada, yada. And that's meaningful grounding. Or I have another tenet, fixing conversation by addressing information overload and translating between values and mentoring and conversation is another thing that I want to do with my research. And so basically anytime that I'm wondering what my research means, what my career means, I can go to these notes and I can reorient myself, and it can motivate me and it can inspire me and it can remind me of what not to do by looking at counter-argument sections or against sections, and it can remind me of what to do by looking at these mission statement sections or these how-to sections or these purpose sections. The bottom line here is ask yourself, where could you use meaningful grounding? Where have your symbols and your concepts become detached from each other, or where have your symbols drifted to concepts that you don't want? What letters can you write yourself, essentially, in definition sections or in how-to sections or in purpose sections that would make a difference for a future you to remind yourself what something you want it to mean and what you want it not to mean? Because those are the things that are useful to write to yourself in the framework of Learning Loop. So remember, take notes, organize the notes so that you can find them in the future when you need them. The future you can find them. And then 3, use those notes to solve your problems and answer your questions. Today we've looked at this philosophy and framework from the aspect of meaningful grounding, and I would love to hear case studies of where this was useful for you, counter arguments that I didn't address, anything like that. Please let me know. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week.